Welcome back to It Is Also Written Ministry. Today's topic is fascinating in that it takes them to two different routes, one leading to Eden and the other one leading to destruction. But how do we decipher between the two when the wide road today looks so appealing? And we should consider these two different ways, these routes that are before us in these times that we live in. The account in Genesis, it says, "And unto Adam he said, Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree, of which I've commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake, in sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life." After Adam fell into sin, notice what the Lord said to him. "Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast done what you ought not, and hast eaten of the fruit which I forbade you to eat, for this cause," he says, "cursed is the ground, not against you, but for your sake." Error, being the opposite of truth, would have said, "Blessed is the ground for thy sake." And instead of saying, "In sorrow shalt thou eat all the days of thy life," error would have said, "In pleasure shalt thou eat all the days of thy life." In other words, while God pronounces a curse, Satan under the same circumstances pronounces a blessing. It's your thing, do what you want to do, or living your best life ever. So it is that the world, naturally being tuned to Satan's speech, expects to live in pleasure all its days. Nevertheless, it is having plenty of sorrow, plenty of it. "Thorn also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field." The devil, of course, would have said, "Roses and flowers shall it bring unto thee." And rather than commanding, "Thou shalt eat the herbs of the field," Satan would have said, "Thou shalt eat of everything you find in the field." True, he does not say it so in the book, but he does say so in the hearts of all living, and they zealously obey his voice. "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it was thou taken, for dust thou art, and dust shalt thou return." And of course, Satan would have said, "In pleasure shalt thou eat bread, until in the process of evolution thou become as God. For out of an insignificant atom wert thou taken, and unto a mighty God shalt thou evolve, if thou continue on and on." What did God say, though? "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat thy bread all the days of thy life." That is, for your own sake, you are now to have hardship in making a living, and you might just as well reconcile yourself to it. Although such was not man's lot before he sinned, it became his lot as soon as he was taken out of the garden, as soon as he had earned the curse. But you ask, why did God purpose that all of us should go through hardship and sorrow before we are taken back into Eden? If he is to take us back, why did he not do it in the beginning, in Adam's day? Well, the answer to all these questions is found in Luke chapter 15, 11 through 13. "And he said, A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the young son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living." The story is that there were 2 sons in the family. The older one chose to remain home. The younger one chose to go away. And you know what happened shortly afterwards? The younger son wasted all of his substance in riotous living. I'm sure that the father knew beforehand that his son was headed for hardship. He loved him and longed to spare the youth from shame, sorrow, and hard trial that he was headed for. The very fact that on the boy's return, the father met him while yet a long way off, and made a banquet for him, even after he had wasted his father's substance and disgraced the family's name. It is evident enough that the father loved the boy supremely. The boy was allowed to leave home only because nothing but experience of his own could ever demonstrate his folly and prove the father's love for him. What forced the boy to dislike home? It was the desire to live riotously. No boy or girl under the same circumstances runs away from home except for the hope of gaining freedom and to practice riotous living, to do at will what the carnal heart longs to do. The prodigal today, one only knows where and what he would buy and where he'd go. The Bible says, "And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want." If you spend all you have and all you earn, you too will sooner or later have famine. Providence brought the famine in order to bring the boy to himself, to his senses. Indeed, no boy runs away from home when he is himself, and conversely, neither does he return home understandingly before he comes to himself. Thus he learns his lesson, but at what cost? At what cost? "And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him." The prodigal obtained a job all right, but it did not fill the bill. He was still in want. And when he had come to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. He finally discovered that he had been playing the fool, and so he began to reason with himself about going back home, saying, Just think how many servants are in my father's house, and they all have plenty. Why should I perish with hunger? But what shall I say when I get there? Having come to himself, he felt, of course, that he must say just the right thing, the thing that would commend him to heaven and to earth. Had that boy taken his father's counsel in the first place, he would not have had to be humiliated, and what a humiliation it was, and what a lesson too, not only for the young, but also for the old. Yes, there are thousands, young and old alike, who learn great lessons, but they often pay a tremendous price only because they have ever listening to the humbug of the devil. Why are they so easily carried away with his allurements? Only because his attractive bait appeals to man's selfish and sinful nature. The prodigal's humiliation awaits all the young who do not profit by the counsel of the older, and all the olders who do not profit by the counsel of the Lord. This is one of the laws of God which no one has ever been able to dodge. The prodigal's experience now answers the question, why did God remove Adam out of the garden? Since God has to forgive him someday anyway, why did he not forgive him shortly after his fall and take him back to Eden? Why could not all mankind have been thus saved from going through the misery and the death before going back to Eden? Had God allowed Adam and Eve to remain in the garden after they had sinned and continued to have access to the tree of life, he would have thereby perpetuated their sinful lives in their sinful state. What a terrible thing that would have been, sinners having to live forever and ever. And had he spared them and their descendants from going through hardship and death, they could no more have come to realize what life of sin is. No more than could the prodigal before going through licentiousness, bankruptcy, hard labor, and poverty. But you see, if the Lord could not have brought Adam and Eve into the garden before first passing through death and the resurrection, did he have to curse the ground and cause them to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow? And why did he have to cause them to eat their bread in sorrow for 6,000 years? Because all who are ever to enter the kingdom, that is, get back into Edom, must first come to themselves as did the prodigal. For all must be brought to realize that everything away from the garden is nothing more than swine husks. Because work is essential, and because sinners by nature dislike work, and thorns and thistles were created to compel them to go to work for a living. If we leave the obnoxious weeds in the ground and spend our time having fun, they will choke out the crops, and we, like the prodigal, will have famine. Thus, no work, no eat. God, who knows what is best for us, has made it that we earn our living the hard way, to work all day long, but with little rest. Those who come to themselves, to them work is pleasure. Only fools hate work. Before the modern machinery was invented, farmers were not so troubled with pestilence as they are now. But just as the machinery increased and improved, so the bugs did too. And for what reason? To still keep us working, and thus out of mischief. The Lord commanded that we should, with sweat, earn our living. But he knew that most of us would not do so if we didn't have to. He also knew that if we didn't have much to do, that we'd get into mischief and into riotous living, and consequently never come to ourselves and never go back to Eden. He therefore cursed the ground for our good. Why did mankind have to wait 6,000 years before he could return to Eden? Because it takes that long to get a large enough number of repentant prodigals. Prodigals who have come to themselves, who realize that it is better to be a doorkeeper in the Father's home than to be sunk in so-called fun away from his home. God is not taking any of us back into Eden in the state that we were born with. No more than he took Adam back into Eden in his fallen state. All must come to themselves, and as a result, the Bible says, affliction shall not rise up a second time. Now we can see why it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into the kingdom. Only the prodigals who through experience realize that this world is not their Father's house. Only those who start back to Eden with the same kind of mind and with the same kind of confession as that of the prodigal are to make up the kingdom. Moreover, when the children of Israel went into the land of Egypt, they made a fine living in Goshen. They lived like kings. Yes, they had even much better living than the best of the Egyptians. God knew, though, that if when the time neared for their deliverance they continued to live like kings, if everything continued to be as easy for them as it had been while Joseph was living, they never would have made up their minds to go back to the promised land. So it was that providential, trying circumstances were brought to cause them to cry day and night for deliverance. Then they were ready to go. To make sure, though, that they all would leave Egypt, the Lord permitted the Egyptian taskmasters to lash their backs and to make their labor extra hard while Moses was in the land. Likewise must the love of the world be beaten out of us, too, if we are ever to start out for our Eden home. If you boys and girls want to have riotous living, you can have it. Indeed, there is more to be had today than there was to be had in the days of the original prodigal. But remember, if you ever get back to our Eden home, you must pay the same price he paid. There is to be no free ticket for any, old or young. Here's a few verses to consider. The fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. The house of feasting brings the end of all men who live for fun, for riotous living. The living will lay it to its heart. Those then who do not lay it to the heart are not really living. They need to be revived. Sorrow is better than laughter, for the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. By much slothfulness the building decay, and through idleness the hand of the house droppeth through. I said in mine heart, God shall judge both the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time, therefore, every purpose and for every work. So God is to judge the wicked and the righteous because there is a time for every purpose and every work. Everyone is to be given an account for his time as well as for his deeds. Because to every purpose there is time and judgment. Therefore misery of a man is great upon him. Because there is a time for every purpose and every work, there is therefore to be a time of judgment for both in the church and in the world. And because there is a time and a season for every purpose, the misery of man is increased if he does not heed this divine law. He must do everything on time, lest his miseries increase. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. The man, a student, and a little ant, a teacher? What a humiliating statement against the idler. The final verse, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. The ant knows what to do and when to do it, and it does it. It never fails to make a living, though it has no boss. Were you to go down into its house, you'd find provisions for more than the seasons required. It knows when the harvest comes and knows how to make the most of it. If a man fails to do as the ant, if he fails to take notice of the time and the seasons, then his miseries shall certainly increase. Had this counsel come from men, we perhaps would not need it. But it came from God, from whom he has control over everything. He knows your life from the time that you were born and the time that you're going to die. He knows what kind of life you are to go through. You may cause yourself to have to go through the prodigal's way, but how much better if you do not? The best way for you is to go the Father's way. Ever remember that there are only two masterminds in the world, the mind of God and the mind of Satan. We as sinners are born with the mind of Satan, and it stays with us until we are born again, that is, born of the Spirit and with the mind of God. To do right then, we must do what is opposite our natural minds tell us, and we shall then be doing what the mind of God is striving to make us do. The young people know what you adults are thinking. They know how much you think about God and His kingdom. They know how much you think of this place and of His work. Since they know all that and much more, then it is time for all of us to realize that we cannot lead the children closer to God's objectives than we ourselves are. We cannot inspire in them faith and zeal in anything while we ourselves do not have it. I do hope that those who are headed for the prodigal's way may come to themselves before a miserable experience comes to them. Thus is the way back to Eden clearly charted for everyone that comes into this world. If you're in a position where you have been wandering from Christ, somewhat of a prodigal, now is the best time to come back to Christ. We here at It Is Also Written Ministry would love to help you to regrip and regain a relationship with Christ. Christ is waiting. God bless you.